From the path from University of Connecticut, bachelor's, skipped her master's, because that wasn't needed. Went to Stanford for a PhD, and worked with Steve Gorelick.
Good.
That's right. And then went to Penn State, through the system up to associate, and decided that she wanted to be closer to the mountains. Okay. Let's see, CV, she has awards for being a young scientist and all sorts of nice presentation awards that she's won over the years. I first got interested in Kamini's research because it's electric, both figuratively and literally. And that she does some very cool measurements that use tomography and tomography techniques, looking at resistivity or conductivity, and to my heart, investigating the spatial variability of some very cool small-scale processes and also larger-scale processes. One interesting diversion on her CV is some paper about the gold mines in Ghana, which we'll have to talk about at some point how that came about. But for the most part, she's really been focused on the hyporheic zone and hyporheic exchange, and really digging in and doing some fantastic detailed measurements in the hyporheic zone. And I'm sure we're in for some cool color plots and some interesting science about the hyporheic zone and hyporheic exchange. Kamini, welcome.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. I don't know, is this just for the recording? Am I okay? So it's great to be here. This is my first time in Corvallis, so I decided in getting the invite to come here that I would talk to you guys about something that was at least close physically to OSU, and that was the H.J. Andrews site, where I think many of you guys have probably trod through. And so I thought that that might be data that you guys would be interested in, and that I would get much different feedback from this crew than from some others. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit what Chad had mentioned, is some groundwater surface water exchange work. I was actually trained as a groundwater hydrologist and have been pulled up to the surface over the last few years by some colleagues. So before I get started, oh, wrong computer. We had some Mac PC issues a moment ago, so we'll see how the conversion goes. I just wanted to thank the people that made this happen. Mike Gusev is a graduate in some ways from this program. He was a postdoc with Roy Haggerty. And was a close colleague of mine at Penn State until I moved this last year. And I'm going to present a fair portion of the work that he and I and a PhD student working with the two of us, Adam Ward, who's now at the University of Iowa, had done. I'd like to thank some of your folks in-house for some of the diagrams I'll be showing you of the H.J. Andrews here in a moment, and then Fred Day-Lewis at the USGS, and then the funding, without which nothing happens. So to preach to the crowd a little bit for this group, because I'm sure that you guys are a much more water-savvy crowd than the standard sort of geoscience department, what I'm going to be talking about today is stream-riparian groundwater exchange and the idea of a hyporheic zone. I'm sure that most of you have heard that term beaten into your heads for many years, but just on the outside chance it's new to you. It comes from two Greek roots, hypos meaning below and rios meaning flow. And the idea is that the hyporheic zone is the part of the aquifer system around a stream where water goes from being, oh, I think I have a pointer maybe. Very small. It's a part of the water system here around a stream where water goes from being surface water to groundwater back to surface water again, either in these meander bends here or underneath the stream itself. And there have been papers published calling a hyporheic zone a river's liver, which I think is a pretty good description of what this thing is supposed to be doing. And it's an interesting biogeochemical hotspot. You have big gradients in dissolved oxygen and organic carbon, and this makes this a really great spot in terms of system dynamics, in terms of denitrification and metal uptake, thermal buffering. It's kind of a cool place to work in the Earth system. So that's what I'm going to be talking about a bit today. So in terms of exploring that space, when we think about how solutes move within streams and how material gets processed in the hyporheic zone, the way that we've traditionally thought about exploring that space has been fairly low tech, in the sense that oftentimes what we do is you and your buddy go out with a 55-gallon drum of dye or salt or some material, you introduce it into that stream, and then you monitor it downstream. At some later point, you get a concentration history associated with that. So that's that concentration time plot I'm showing you up here. And if you just had advection and diffusion, you'd have this sort of quasi-Gaussian curve shown here, and there's a ton of research that thinks about the long tail that happens, that move something from being a purely advective system to something where you see this transient storage, where stuff is getting stuck for a longer period of time. And usually what we do is we fit those data with models that tell us about the area of that zone where that storage is occurring and how quickly materials are moving in and out of that hypereich zone. The only other option we have in terms of exploring that space is generally to do what a colleague of mine called acupuncture to a field site, which is just at some point you're changing the system that you're interested in, right? And so what we'd like to be able to do is find other ways to understand what's happening around these stream systems. There's been a ton of papers that, some from right here in your neighborhood, that show how complicated that groundwater surface water system is, right? And so the idea of this image, which I just really like from a paper that Steve Wanzel, who's here in the audience, had written a little while back, was that you can see that the flow paths within the system are really complicated. You've got some really long flow paths, some really short flow paths. You've got gaining and losing parts of a stream along its length. And there's a couple things that aren't encompassed in this image too, one of which is time-varying change, so how things change seasonally in terms of exchange within a stream, and also that other dimension that's into the page, right? And this is obviously a very steep stream in my PowerPoint example of it, but all the pathways that are happening there in the Z dimension. So my colleague Mike Youssef and I, at one point when we were at Penn State, were just kicking around some ideas that were really basic about how these systems work. And we had a couple of questions that we posited a few years back when we first started thinking about this work. And one of which was just about how that zone changes in space and time. And so if we think about seasonal variations in that hypereich zone, how can we measure that, and what does that mean in terms of the biogeochemistry that might be happening at some of these sites? And another question we wanted to know is how are those changes controlled by the geology, the morphology of our site, and how steep that stream was. And we made a diagram of some pretty simple hypotheses. And one of the things that we put forward was, and you can already probably find holes with these, but our simplest hypothesis said, well, maybe if we take a look at how a hypereich zone changes seasonally, if we look during times of high base flow, meaning lots of groundwater contributions to streams, usually in sort of spring type months, maybe what's going to happen is that when we have these higher water tables, what we're going to see is that the hypereich zone might be compressed by the fact that you've got this water table that's pushing in on this stream system that's here. And then at times of lower base flow, like in the middle of summer or in August, as that water table relaxes, maybe we would see more exchange because the water table wasn't acting on that stream quite so strongly. It was a hypothesis that we thought of at that time. And the other thing we were wondering about was cross-valley versus down-valley components of flow. And so how that would change with the steepness of a particular stream system. And it seems kind of obvious that the flatter your stream is, the more cross-valley flow you might have than something that's very steep. And so we thought that it would be interesting to try to quantify these ideas. Now, the question, of course, in order to answer some of these questions is how to actually say something about the extent of a hypereich zone. And short of hydrologic acupuncture, we thought that there must be some other ways. My undergrad degree was in geophysics, and there's still a special place in my heart for some of those tools. They're certainly not a silver bullet, but in some cases they help us. They provide some data we wouldn't otherwise have. And so the method that we decided to take a look at was electrical resistivity, which is perhaps one of the simplest geophysical tools that's going, in the sense that all that you need in order to make this happen, really, is a car battery, a voltmeter, and some electrodes, and an ammeter. And when I say electrodes, I don't mean electrodes like geochemists use that are fancy. I mean like 4 pieces of rebar. And so what you end up doing with these systems is you set up a series of electrodes, you hook a car battery up to 2 of these electrodes, you drive a current between them, and then you measure the potential between another 2. And using Ohm's law, if you go back to first year physics, if you know voltage and you know current, you can back out the resistance of the subsurface. What's cool about that, though, is that resistance is related to resistivity, which is an intrinsic property of a material. And we can talk about how we get between resistance and resistivity in a moment. But it's correlated to a bunch of things that we as hydrologists are interested in. How much pore space there is, how connected that pore space is, and the salinity of that pore space. And all of those things are useful to us. It's also related to lithology. But if we think about these tools in a time-lapse mode, if we collect data and how it changes through time, we can often get rid of that lithology piece. So what we decided to do was look at a series of tracer tests, things that have been done in these stream systems for years and years, and also add a geophysical piece to this. So this is a little bit of a conversion math problem. All my equations are going to be a little funny. But the state of the practice here is this. Archie, back in 1942, said that there was a relationship between fluid and bulk electrical conductivity. It was related through this formation factor, which basically is like a porosity tortuosity term. And so the idea would be that if I can measure the bulk conductivity, let me put this on the board, since I can't tell if you can see it or not, but the fluid conductivity is equal to the formation factor times the bulk conductivity. That if you can measure the bulk conductivity with an electrical resistivity tool, then it should be correlated to changes in fluid conductivity. And that's the total premise of this method, because that formation factor should stay approximately constant through the test that we're doing. The porosity, the tortuosity aren't changing significantly during this time. And so the idea would be is that you would get two empty squares, and they would be related to each other, that your bulk conductivity and your fluid conductivity then should be related by some sort of straight line relationship. And this is in the absence of some other complicated petrophysics, and people that study rock physics relationships will talk about surface conductance and other things that make this equation slightly more complicated. But in general, that's the relationship that people would expect to see. So what we decided to do is take a look at this sort of relationship in a couple of different systems. So I'm going to talk about a groundwater system just for a second to show you a really nice example of what electrical geophysics can bring to a transport story before I bring you back to a stream system, because the stream systems are slightly more complicated, and I'll explain that to you in just a moment. So when we first started thinking about using electrical geophysical tools to say something about transport process, we were working in groundwater systems, and one of the systems we looked at was an aquifer storage recovery site. And the idea of aquifer storage recovery is times of water surplus, to take that extra water, inject it into some subsurface aquifer, you store it for some period of time, and then you pump it back out when you need it. And part of subsurface storage is you don't have the evaporation losses you would have if you had a surface reservoir. Now there's lots of questions about aquifer storage recovery, and it's a very thin literature actually on ASR processes, a bit in the engineering literature, but in general the science literature is quite thin. But there's some questions about what happens to potable water when you inject it into a subsurface aquifer. Most ASR sites are in coastal environments or areas where the aquifers are brackish, and so there's some concern about taking fresh water and displacing this sort of salty water that's in the subsurface. There's questions about where the bubble, as they call it, where the freshwater bubble moves, because you have a hydraulic gradient that's going to take that water somewhere with time. There's questions about changes in the chemistry as this water mixes with whatever's in the background, and then biologically what's happening as you introduce this water. There's been a lot of concern with people interested in sort of mixing along the edges of the bubble. So what happens in those zones and how you're losing water quality at those particular locations. So we looked at a site in Charleston, South Carolina. And this was a USGS research site. It's a limestone aquifer. And this was actually an emergency water supply for the town of Charleston in case of hurricanes. And so what they had done at the site was they had injected fresh water about 100 meters below land surface into a fractured aquifer. And that's the central blue well here. And then they had a few observation wells around it that were all pretty close, all within 10 meters of that injection well. The idea was to inject water, store it, and pull it back out of that same central well. So we did a pilot scale experiment at this site, and I'm going to show you data from 2 wells because it turned out that the third one wasn't well connected. We can see that in the head data and also in the concentration data. So that should be a conductivity signal up there. That empty square I think is going to signify conductivity for this talk. So what this is this is some geophysical data. This is the lowest tech geophysical data that you can possibly imagine. What this is it's 4 electrodes within that fractured space. You're collecting, you're driving current between 2 and measuring potential between 2. And so all this is it's the resistance that you measure in the field. There's no fancy mathematics here, there's no inversion, it's just raw data from the field. And what you see is basically what you would expect is that you start off with a sort of salty aquifer, you inject fresh water, you store it, and then you pump it back out. You'll notice this is a really short experiment, it's 9 days. Turns out it's really hard to get anybody to convince to sit around for a season's worth of data collection, and this was sort of a pilot experiment. So what you see here is exactly what you would expect from the geophysics. What's really interesting though is that the hydrologic response is a little bit different. We were pulling samples from this same fractured zone, and what we saw there was something a little bit different. And it's obviously, well, it's pretty apparent from this image. What happens is during the storage zone, the storage period is really different in the fluid samples than it was in the geophysics. What happens when we inject that fresh water and then we turn the pump off is we see this rebound. We see this kick back up in the fluid conductivity. Well, my first thought was that this might just be a function of scale, that you're talking about a 60 milliliter sample and the support volume of a very small sample when compared to a geophysical measurement with electrodes that are a meter apart. But as we were making a bunch of models to try to explain this, it turned out that any significant change in conductivity, in the fluid conductivity, should have translated to something in the bulk. And so that what we were seeing here was something a little different than what we would have expected. And in fact, if we plotted these two things versus each other, what we got wasn't this curve, this straight line relationship, but a hysteresis between the bulk and the fluid conductivity. So what we did is we put forward a hypothesis about what might be happening. And this is where the idea of sort of transient storage in streams is going to come back to what we're talking about here. So this is what we thought might be happening, is that there was a disconnect in timing between what the fluid conductivity was sampling and what the bulk conductivity, the geophysics, was seeing, in that we have some dead-end pore space within these aquifer systems. So what we thought happened is as we injected fresh water within that aquifer system, what happened is that fresh water displaces the salty water that's in that pore space, right? So what ends up happening is your fluid conductivity decreases. Your bulk conductivity also decreases, but maybe not as much as you might think, because there's some dead-end pore space that still has salty water in it. When we turn the pump off, that system stops being so highly advective. And what ends up happening through time is that some of that salty water that was sort of trapped in that space diffuses back out into the connected pore space. This is all hypotheses. And leads to that rebound that we see in the fluid conductivity. So dead-end pore space, salty water, turn the pumps off. It ends up back out in the connected pore space and we sample it. The geophysics doesn't know that anything has changed though, because to it, the total dissolved solids, the mass that's in that aquifer has not changed. So geophysics knows nothing about what's changed in this system. And then in recovery, we pump these things back out. So it was an idea that maybe what we were actually able to see was that dead-end pore space, how stuff was getting stuck behind. So we made some models. Sort of the simplest models I've ever made. These were some ModFlow and MT3D models. It's a 1D radial model. And what we did is we tested whether or not that could at least be a plausible way to describe the data that we saw at the site. So what I'm showing you here are 3 panels. This first panel here is a proxy, model results from what the geophysics should have looked like for our model, bulk conductivity through time. Here's what the fluid conductivity through time should look like, so that was what we would have gotten from the samples. And here's the hysteresis curve between the two. So this is a 1D radial model, a pretty simple model, and while it doesn't describe our data perfectly, what you can see is that there's similarities, certainly, between our data and these models. We're describing most of the variance here. So what was interesting about this is that things like mass transfer rate, and in this case what I mean by mass transfer is not changing between phase, but actually solutes leaving dead-end pore space and ending up in the mobile pore space, are often fitting factors. And here we have an additional set of data that help us fit that factor. So in this case, what I'm showing you is what we see in the data, something similar. You inject fresh water, you store it, you pump it out. You do see a rebound in the fluid conductivity and then a hysteresis. And this is assuming a dual porosity type model. What was interesting about having the geophysical data, though, is that we could mess around with this model a little bit. If we turn the mass transfer rate up and said solutes can move really easily between connected and disconnected pore space, then it's kind of like having one domain again, one porosity in which all the material hangs out. And so you don't see any difference in the geophysics than what you do in the fluid. If the mass transfer rate was really low, you don't have enough time for that fresh water to actually get into the less mobile pore space. What's interesting is that if your mass transfer rate is too high or too low, this hysteresis curve starts to collapse back towards a straight line, as predicted by sort of classical theory, 2 different slopes, because the porosity, the total porosity that's being accessed in these 2 cases is different. In the blue line, it would be a connected plus a disconnected porosity in this model, and in the red line, it would have just been the connected porosity. So these are some models that we had made. So who cares? The idea was here is that what we might be able to do with these geophysical tools is say something about the parts of the aquifer that we can't easily sample, and that we might be able to estimate some of these properties and processes that we otherwise don't have a lot of data on. So what we decided to do is take these sorts of ideas that we had used in groundwater systems and apply them to stream systems. The problem, of course, with stream systems is that things get a lot more complicated because you still have connected and disconnected pore space, like we've been talking about. But in this case, you've got a mobile piece of your aquifer, which is your stream itself, is completely mobile, right? That's the connected part of your aquifer. But then you also have an aquifer that's got connected and disconnected pore space. So suddenly your system just becomes a lot more complicated. Also, your immobile and mobile pore spaces no longer overlap like they might in an aquifer system. Here they're actually in two different places. So you've got connected streams and sort of aquifer systems that are partially connected, partially disconnected, and they don't overlap in terms of their spatial location. And what that means is that we can't just use raw geophysical measurements like I showed you. We're actually gonna have to do some image reconstruction. And the image reconstruction process is plagued with its own problems, which I will talk about here in just a second. So what happens with these geophysical tools is that rather than use the raw data, we usually have to make images to say anything about what we see in those data. The problem is what happens when we do these reconstructions is that the images we produce are not reality. It's the beer goggles version of the subsurface. And so what happens is that if you have, for instance, here's an example, subsurface section where you've got electrical resistivity of the subsurface, what you would usually get back from an electrical image is something that looks like this. It's too smooth. It often contains some sort of artifacts from the inversion process. I'll talk about what that is. But the important part about this is in the geophysical reconstruction process, you lose some information. And most importantly, your relationship between your hydrologic parameter you might be interested in, like water content or salinity, and what you're actually measuring, which is electrical conductivity, varies in space. And so that means using a relationship like Archie's law, like this relationship here, is a problem because this relationship is actually going to vary in space as a function of the fact that this bulk conductivity is now reconstructed. So there's some complicating issues with using geophysical data. So just the quick version of what happens in the inversion process that makes things messy. So one of the problems is just how geophysicists parameterize the inverse problem compared to hydrologists. So I'm sure many people in this audience have worked with inverse methods. And the way hydrologists sort of typically think about the inverse procedure is a little different than geophysicists. What often happens in hydrogeology is we take the subsurface and we break it into, I don't know, say 3 layers that we think that the hydraulic conductivity varies in some sort of layered sense. And we take tens or hundreds of hydraulic head data and we try to solve for those hydraulic conductivity layers. So we tend to under-parameterize our systems as hydrogeologists. We're looking for a few parameters with a lot of data. Geophysicists do almost the exact opposite. What they do is they break the subsurface into millions of pixels, and then they have 10 data, and they try to find a relationship that allows them to make really pretty color maps, right? It's a little different than how we think about things. The problem is, as you well know, is that if you've got more unknowns than you have data, you can't come up with a unique solution. And so the geophysicist's way around that is to regularize. So for instance, if this was your inverse problem, you have 5 unknowns, you're interested in the seismic velocity of those 5 boxes, and you have 5 data that inform individually on those pixels, you're in great shape, right? That linear algebra is easy. 5 unknowns, 5 data. Here, what you have is something more like what happens in reality. It's still a very idealized version. You have some parts of the aquifer that you don't have any data on at all. Others where maybe multiple data are contributing at the same point. So what ends up happening is you have an equation that you can't read. The way geophysicists do the inverse problem is that they say, well, I'm going to have an objective function where I'm going to try to fit 2 things. The misfit in my data and a model misfit term, what my model looks like. And so rather than just take your data and try to fit it, so well, you might want to minimize this, the data you collect in the field, and how that compares to, say, a forward model of your data. What you really want to difference would be what you're collecting in the field from a model observation. What they've done here is they add another piece so that they can come up with a unique solution because there's so many unknowns. And this piece usually looks like something like a second derivative filter. And if you think about what a second derivative is, it's a roughener, right? Every time you take the derivative of some function, it becomes more rough. And so they try to minimize the roughness, and they end up with very smooth images. So what ends up happening then is that regardless of how many data you collect in many of these systems, because they're sort of mixed determined, that even if you have a very sort of a concrete image here that you're trying to image, what you're going to get back out is something that's a little bit blurry. This is a tough thing for geophysics to image anyway, is properties that have really strong contrasts like that. Geophysics has a hard time with it, especially when you're thinking about these overdetermined inversions. So that's one issue. And so the reason I'm telling you this is, as I'm showing you these images, I want you to think about them as being blurry. And our ability to estimate things like mass exactly are not going to be quite right. The other thing that's happening is that electrical geophysics is based on a diffusion equation. It's the same as the fluid flow equation. But what that means is that your resolution is always going to be best near your electrodes. So if you're thinking about a borehole sort of method, your resolution is best closest to the boreholes. If you're thinking about surface methods, which is what we'll talk about mostly today, your resolution is best near the surface. And as you fall away from your electrodes, your resolution gets poorer. And your relationship, your understanding of the hydraulic parameters you might be interested in, or the salinity, or whatever it is going to fall apart as you get farther away from the electrodes. So I just want to caveat these data sets a bit so that you know what you're looking at. So what's going to happen in the field is we're going to collect a bunch of surface measurements for the data that I'm showing you today. And sort of the old 1950s way of thinking about electrical geophysical data is they used to plot them before there were computers by taking the location of the 4 electrodes, splitting the distance, and then going down in depth, whatever the spacing of the electrodes was, and assigning the resistance measurement they made to that point. And so that's what this is a plot of right here. It's called a pseudo-section. It's an old sort of 1950s way of plotting data. And all these little black points are associated with one measurement using 4 electrodes. So the way the inverse procedure is going to work is I'm going to have some data shown here with some interpolation scheme that I don't really understand between those points. And you're going to try to make a model that creates simulated data from your model that looks like what you had in the field. And if that's the case, then the model that you have for that is going to be what people talk about as being the subsurface system. Keep in mind, again, that this image is going to be too smooth, at least with the regularization type that's most commonly used. Okay, so what we're going to do is the state of the practice is that we're going to invert these data. We're going to have a map of bulk electrical conductivity. We're going to apply an Archie's law type relationship to it and change this map of bulk electrical conductivity, for instance, into salinities or something like that. And just keep in mind that these salinities, which is what we'll talk about for these tracer tests, is not going to be the truth, but it's going to have this, this sort of blunted out version associated with it. And there's going to be artifacts that you guys will pick up on as I show you these images. All right, so what we did is we took a look at 2 different sites. We wanted to think about the gradient piece of the story, as well as the seasonal piece. And so what we wanted to do is do a series of tracer tests during baseflow recession. So we came out in the spring at both of these sites, H.J. Andrews, which is here and local to you guys, and then the Leading Ridge site, which is in Pennsylvania, near the Shale Hills Critical Zone Observatory in Pennsylvania, and used these as 2 contrasting sites. And we did tracer tests at both of these sites throughout the spring of 2010. And the idea was to take a look at how the hyporheic zone changed seasonally, and also how it changed in these 2 different environments, the H.J. Andrews, which was quite steep, and Leading Ridge, which was quite flat. And so that was a piece of the plan. The other thing we did is we had many tens of piezometers in both of these systems that we used, and we measured heads in all of these pieces so we could take a look at the cross valley versus down valley components of flow and how they changed in these 2 systems. Which I won't talk about today because of time. So I'm going to focus on the H.J. Andrews today, just to show you the data that you guys would be most familiar with. I have the Leading Ridge data if anyone would like to see that too. So we ended up working in 2 watersheds, probably familiar to many of you. Here, Watershed 1 and Watershed 3. For the time being, what I'm going to do is talk about Watershed 3. Its similarity to Watershed 1 is fairly high in the case of what we're talking about now anyway. They're both fairly confined streams, and they both have a fairly steep steady reach slope when compared to the sites in Pennsylvania. So this is an image provided to us by Roy's group. But here's Watershed 3, and just keep in mind that the way that I'm showing you this image flow is actually going up the page right now, sort of different than hydrologic convention often is. But what you see in this, this schematic of Watershed 3 is that there's quite a lot of instrumentation already in place. All of these little red circles are wells that were there before we got there. So part of the motivation for working in Watershed 3 is that we already had a well network that was in place. What we did is we instrumented all these little yellow crosses. So what we did is we put in a series of electrodes, again, just metal attached to wire, to which we attached an electrical resistivity system. This system of stream that we were looking over was about 30 meters, and we injected our tracer about another 100 meters up gradient from this. We used just a sodium chloride tracer. Here's an image of the site for those of you that haven't been there. These little white PVC poles sticking up were what our electrodes were. We just built them using a stainless steel foil attached to the bottom of a piece of PVC and banged those in as best as possible into this very rocky stream bed. Oops, wrong computer. One thing I just want to point out for you is there's a boulder here in this schematic that you can actually see in this photograph. It looks much bigger in the photograph than it does in the schematic. And part of the reason that I'm pointing it out is just it'll serve as what Adam Ward had called his gut check boulder. But it serves to, it'll show up in some of the tomograms I show you. I'm going to talk about 5 different lines of geophysical data indicated by each of these stripes. I'm not going to talk about the 6th line only because we had a lot of trouble with it. We were actually never able to invert quality images off that. And I think part of the reason is the coupling here on this gigantic boulder here. We had a lot of trouble getting good electrical connection between the electrodes and that rock. In the past, having worked in some fractured rock systems, I mean, all you need is some way of getting current into the ground. When you have electrodes, metal sitting on a hunk of rock, that's not a particularly good connection. We tried to use what we had done in the past, which is actually saturating cloth material, baby diapers actually, in a saline material and keeping them on the system, but we just weren't able to quite maintain good contact. I'm going to focus a little bit on the flashing line, in part because it's kind of in an interesting place within the watershed, which is between the upper part of the watershed, which is fairly steep and very narrow, and the bottom part of the watershed, which is flat and wide. So we did 4 tracer injections in the summer of 2010. And I'm showing them to you here, along with the stream discharge plotted as a yellow line in the background. What you see is sort of the end of season storms, and then here a very clear base flow recession through the summer. What we did is we conducted tracer experiments here at 4 different times throughout the summer, bouncing between Watershed 1 and Watershed 3. So what I'm showing you here, and I'm going to walk you through these slowly, is the results of the geophysical data from this experiment. So I'm only showing you 3 of the 4 tracer tests. The second test, which was at 14 liters a second or so, isn't shown here, only because we had some issues with the pump where we injected a little bit more salt. It's not a problem in terms of interpretation, but because I'm showing you this in a very qualitative way, it's distracting. So I just took those images out for now, but if you'd like to see them, you can. What these are reconstructed geophysical data. So this has gone through the sort of step of taking our resistance measurements from the field and converting them to resistivities. And these are differenced from the background condition. So what you're going to be seeing as we step through time here, through a 48-hour tracer injection, is a change in conductivity, blue, where there's salt. So we've got the sodium chloride tracer that is being injected up gradient. What's going to happen is that you'll see the time click down here on the left-hand side. So right now we're 3 hours into the tracer injection, and you can see in each of these cases the stream fairly clearly lights up in all of these examples. As I step forward to 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours through the injection, what you see is that the stream itself lights up, but you also see this ring around the stream system that also shows a change in electrical conductivity. What's also interesting is that we monitored after we turned the tracer injection off. So here's 6 hours after the end of injection, 24 hours after the end of injection. What's really interesting about this is that you can see that depending on the difference in discharge, which would be correlated to a change in velocity, that you see differences in how quickly the stream itself actually clears out. Here at sort of high discharge, what we're finding is that the stream itself cleans out almost immediately after we end the tracer test. Within 6 hours, the stream concentration itself was pretty close to a background condition, both in the fluid measurements we made within the stream and also what we see in the geophysics. What's really cool about this, though, is we see this bathtub ring of salt that's moved its way into this subsurface system and is still there. So even though we've removed most of the mass from the stream itself, there's quite a lot of mass that's stuck behind in the aquifer. So whether this is a hyporeic zone exactly is an open question, right? Because that means it has to be surface water to groundwater to surface water. But what we do know is where the salt has ended up within the system. And then within 24 hours, though, that a lot of that material is gone. So one of the things that was interesting is that this is a progression through time from spring to later summer. And one of the things that we had hypothesized early was clearly wrong, which was this. If we took a look conditions, what we did not see is a smaller hyporeic zone than we did at lower flows. And in retrospect, when we think about this hypothesis, that's pretty simple. And that we're showing here sort of a two-dimensional system of a much more complicated three-dimensional world in which things are happening upstream of this image that's here. There's also a change in the stream flow, the discharge and consequently the velocity that we didn't really think about, even though we drew a difference in stream flow within these systems, that also controls the way that hyporeic zone is going to appear in terms of the stream's interaction with that aquifer system. So this hypothesis ended up just being much too simple. If we take those 5 lines that we looked at, so that one cross-section I just showed you in the last slide was at that transition point between that very steep narrow part of the aquifer, it was this transect right here, and the flatter, wider area, which is down here. What we can do is we can take these images and take a look at them in a 3-dimensional sense. One of the things to notice here is, again, this is going to be a percent change, and this is just one of the 4 tracer tests, the 7 liter per second case, so this is part of the way through the summer. You'll notice right here, it might be a little hard to see, there's sort of a whitish area here where you see no change, that's that boulder. So you see no salinity going in and around that boulder, no change in salinity. What I'm going to do is just step you through a couple steps here, a couple of hours through this tracer test. Here's the conductivity in the stream with time, and you see there's a little bit of bouncing around, our best attempts at keeping this constant. And what you'll see up above is an isosurface plot of the electrical geophysical imaging. So again, wider, flatter valley, steeper, narrower valley up top. So as we skip through, you know, what we basically see is a big blue blob migrating in and around the stream. And then you actually see some buildup here at the very bottom transect where we had a large fallen log in this location. But you see some of these little pathways coming and going within this system, and then the slow cleanup of that space. So one of the things that's interesting about these data is that even though they're kind of a blurry version of the subsurface, and our ability to estimate things like masses from these data I think are limited, we can say something a little bit about pathways in a way that we couldn't before, in a blurry way. But they're data on where solutes are actually transporting within this system. One of the things that we decided to do was try to do something slightly more quantitative with these data, which was to look at a temporal moment analysis of the geophysical data. All that equation says is that if I was interested in the temporal moments of some system, all I need to know in order to do that is the concentration through time of some system. And so, sorry, I need a T in here. Where do I want to put this? There. That the moment that I'm interested in, if I'm interested in things like the tracer mass at some point, how much mass is past a certain location, or if I want to know the mean arrival time or the temporal variance, the only thing I actually have to track is concentration through time, and that's something that we measure all the time anyway. So if I have these concentration through time curves, I can back out all of these moments. So rather than look at concentration through time, which we have here, what we did is we looked at conductivity through time in that 3-dimensional space that was collected with the electrical geophysical data. So what I'm going to show you is just a couple of those moments from that. So here is those same transects that I had shown you a moment ago. Again, that wider, flatter valley is down here, and that steeper, narrower valley is up here. And what this is a plot of the mean arrival time as based on the electrical data. One of the things that's interesting here is a couple things that show up of interest, one of which is that the lower the number is, or the darker the color, the more quickly something is arriving. So if you take a look at this plot, it's a little bit confusing, right? Because what you would think is that it kind of looks like the solute arrives downstream first, which would be some really interesting physics if that's actually what happened, that the solute somehow skipped over the upper part of the stream and showed up at the bottom part first. What we actually have here is sort of a resolution problem, and it shows some of the limitations of these geophysical tools in terms of what they can do. What's happening is down here where we've got this lower, flatter valley, the salt itself has, is leaving the stream and is actually able to get into some more of this aquifer system surrounding the stream, and the data are a little bit more meaningful in terms of the time. Up here, where the valley is really narrow and really steep, we see less exchange, and the geophysics isn't able, the resolution isn't actually high enough to even see the tracer. So I think what's happening here is that we have the tracer migrating down through this stream system almost undetected by the electrical geophysics at some level, at least at early time, and then it shows up much more clearly down here where the valley flattens out. One of the things that's interesting is that if you take a look at this timing here, that's sort of 24 hours, which is what you would sort of expect on this 48-hour injection in terms of arrival times in these locations. But we don't have a lot of information about what's happening in the upper part of this aquifer. So there's some geophysical limitations. We do really well in steep, flat, or I'm sorry, in flat, wide valleys, and we don't do so well in terms of resolution in very steep, confined systems. If we take a look at this mean arrival time through all of the tracer experiments that we conducted, we can draw a couple of conclusions. Here are these 5 transects again, and what I'm showing you here is the mean arrival time in the X and Y direction in pixels that were deemed meaningful based on their resolution. What we notice is that in general, in a broad sense, that you notice that the mean arrival time is later during baseflow recession, which probably makes quite a lot of sense in terms of changes in velocity within the system. And what we're able to do with some of these geophysical tools is highlight those effective flow paths. If we take a look at the next moment, if we take a look at the temporal variance in time, we see absolutely no change in terms of these transects or through time. And so while the advection story is a little bit different in these cases, the spreading story, the dispersion diffusion story, doesn't change significantly from time step to time step. However, if we take a look at the skewness, which would tell us something about the transient storage piece, all of these things are coupled together, so I'm pulling these apart a little bit simply. But if I take a look at the skewness that we see, we actually see something really interesting in these cases. Again, you see that especially downstream, where we have this flat, wider valley, where the resolution of the instrument is high enough to tell us something about process, what we find is that we see very long tails in these yellow and white curves. So this is the part of the aquifer where we're seeing long transient storage, where we're seeing material that's hanging around for a long period of time. And that's in contrast to areas where we don't see the tracer move or we don't see long tails. So what's interesting about that is in the lower part of the system, we see something about storage. The upper part of the system, again, we don't see much that's meaningful because the geophysics doesn't have the resolution to really image that area well. So the lesson here, I think, is that the geophysics can tell you something about process when the resolution is good enough. Again, there's that boulder. You can see it in all of these images. So if we step back to where we started and some of the things that we were interested in, some of the basic hypotheses we put forward weren't quite right. But the answer to this particular site is still open for us, I guess. One of the things that we saw was that we saw a larger extent of hyperrheic zone early in the season, but it's confounded by flow rate, or maybe velocity would actually be the more meaningful term than flow rate. Confounds that simple explanation of water table control that we had put forward in this simple image here. The slope story is interesting if we compare it to leading ridge. In these very flat, wide valleys, we do a much better job of imaging tracer movement than we do in the steep valleys here at the H.J. Andrews. And so what we found is that the ER can't really do a good job of imaging tracer transport in these really confined systems. But in areas where we actually have good resolution, where the systems are moving a little bit more slowly, we can start to parse apart process in a much more distributed way than we would otherwise have data for. Again, this is not a magic bullet in any sense. I tried to give you an idea of how the geophysics is complicated in the inversion process and the implications for this, but it's something beyond the typical sort of measurements of concentration we get from point sources within our aquifer system. So to conclude, in this case, I think electrical resistivity, we've used it in the past in groundwater system to say something about transient storage. And I think it's got great application for stream systems as well, understanding that there are caveats in the inversion process. But what we do get is a fully distributed, sort of minimally invasive image of the subsurface. What's new about this work was, to our knowledge, it was the first time that people had coupled these geophysical tools with stream tracer tests, and that we were getting a sense of transport pathways in 2D and 3D in the blurry beer goggles version of the subsurface. And one of the things that's interesting is this idea of temporal moment analysis using the geophysical data, and that may be able to help us infer process and where those processes are controlling within the subsurface. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions to get us started? John.
Neat talk, fun stuff, and a great you view of the bottom of streams. That's cool. And a couple little questions. One was the wells. I mean, I thought you had a bunch of wells out there. Do you guys sample? What is it? How do those samples correspond to the estimations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually should have pulled those data. In fact, I may even have them in here somewhere. We did. We sampled all of those wells frequently, in fact, and so we were continuously. There were 5 of us out there at any point, continuously running around sampling those wells at the same time. The changes that we see in those wells match in terms of location with what we see in the electrical images in terms of the timing. What's different is the magnitude of the change that we see in the streams, in the stream and also in the wells that were in the hyporeic zone external to the stream. The change in concentration there is much more significant in terms of a % change than what we would see in the geophysics, which makes some sense because when you're taking that small sample out of a well, you have a significant change in concentration that is averaged out a bit with the geophysical tools. But in terms of timing, those things look very similar. So we do have those measures. We also took head measurements in all of those wells, and one of the things that we saw, and it may not be a sort of important result in some ways, but was interesting nonetheless, is that the hydraulic gradient at this site didn't really change throughout the entire baseflow recession. It's such a steep site that flow is sort of headed the same direction at all times. It did not necessarily map topography. People have seen at plenty of other sites, but certainly we make the assumption that hydraulic gradients would parallel topography where we don't have other information, and at the site there's enough wells that you can show that that's not the case. But the concentration measurements match in terms of timing, but not in terms of magnitude of change with the geophysics. And I think the only example I have here is not ideal, and that this is actually the in-stream measurements, but this is the same. See if I can show this to you. The same sort of idea here, which is what I have here is just a series of transects. The electrical resistivity data here is shown as these crosses. And this is as a % change from the background condition. And this is the in-stream measurement. So you see some differences here in terms of the behavior. This is not the well data, this is the stream data, but unfortunately it's all I have. But what you see in the geophysics is a slower increase in concentration just because the averaging is so different, and then a much longer tail because of the stuff that's stuck behind. But the same sort of data exists for all those wells.
And then just a quick follow-up then. That would, what about modeling? And I know that Roy, you did some modeling with Modflow, right?
Well,
was it
Mike, I think it was Mike and Steve and Mark have done the most, I think. So plus Mike and Justin.
Where is that area? It's easy to, that's in the future?
No, it's ongoing. So we had a postdoc that was working on this project that had started with a COMSOL model, and actually I had talked this morning with Brian Wood about COMSOL a little bit. I had made a COMSOL model of this site, because there's actually a lot of things that confound these data that could be parsed out with some simple models. There's temperature issues, there's changes in water table dynamics, and the way those affect the electrical data, I think, are also important. So we had a coupled fluid flow, solute transport, and electrical flow model in COMSOL before that student left. And then there's a new postdoc that's now still at Penn State who has been working on this project, but she actually can't run his models because COMSOL has updated itself in that time and they're not backward compatible. So she started from scratch and actually can't get the transient solute model, the transient solute transport to actually run. So it's we're hindered just by time. That's something that I think is the obvious thing to do with these data, but we just haven't gotten there. Ricardo.
Kamini, every time I've gone to AGU, there's a discussion about the window of detection of these tracer tests. And because this is using kind of a similar analysis with the salt tracer that we use, I wonder if you think that this is a step forward towards improving that window of detection problem that we have.
Well, I guess what it does for you is that it lets you know where stuff is still within that system, right? So part of the problem with the window of detection is that the longer you monitor, the more mass you get back, or the shorter you monitor, the less mass you get back, right? In part is some piece of that issue. And so I guess what what these other tools can provide for you is the idea that there certainly is mass left in that system and where that might be. I don't know that it gets around this problem. I think we still have the same problem. The only difference is now maybe we know a little bit more about where that mass is within this system. But other than that, I think that I don't know if this contributes or helps fix that problem in any way. I feel like we could still monitor for much, much longer, and some of those flow paths would eventually get back to the stream, and that system would clean itself out. I suppose that you could potentially use those geophysical images to try to see when you're back to a background condition in the geophysics where there's no remaining mass, and you could use that as a decision-making variable in terms of stopping a tracer test, I suppose. You could say that I've monitored this for long enough that I feel like I've gotten back most of the mass within the system, and that I don't see it, at least within the detection of the geophysics. But I don't know how meaningful that would be. The stream hydrologist would probably have something more to say about that than I would. But
so when you are out in the field, can you estimate kind of in real time you have all the mass watched?
And no, yeah. In fact, I don't even know that we can do it in not real time. I feel like the geophysics is good at a couple things. It's really good at mean arrival times. It's really good at seeing when something shows up. We do a really lousy job with mass and with spatial variances in general. And part of that is because of the way that we invert with state of the practice. Because we smooth everything out, what ends up happening is our mass gets smeared out over a bunch of pixels. And so our estimates of mass tend to be pretty poor, and our spatial variance, I was talking about time stuff here, but if we just take a look at an image in time, our spatial variance is always too big because we smear stuff out. There's ways around this. There's lots of people that have worked on really clever ways to invert these data using moments, actually, as your controlling variable or object-based inversion. There's other things you can do that get around some of these problems. But I think in the field we have some trouble. What we can do, though, and what we tend to do in the field is we take a look at the raw measurements, and we can actually track those apparent resistivities through time. And so what we'll often see in the field is whatever our background resistivity is, or conductivity. I introduce a tracer, I see an increase in conductivity, I see all those little lines move up, and then we'll see them go back down. And once they're back down near some background case, we say, oh, well, then most of this mass is gone. But in terms of actual quantitative calculations, we can't do a very good job of that on the fly. And in fact, I don't even know if we can do a good job of it not on the fly, to be honest. Things like mass are hard for us. Right.
Well, I really like this figure. I'm not sure if I've seen this one before, but I've heard maybe Adam mention reference to this. But it's really interesting because you have the stream tracer showing basically no effect whatsoever in tail. In other words, after the tracer test is done, you can't see anything in the stream, but you've obviously got a hyperglycic zone full of salt. And that's really just, that's something that so many of us have seen over and over again. It does go to this window detection issue, is that the stream tracer is really pretty insensitive to the hyperglycic exchange, whereas of course, you've obviously got a lot of hyperglycic exchange going on.
Yeah, I don't know if it, I guess you could use it, I guess what I was saying is that maybe you can use this as a decision variable, that at 4 or 5 days you're back to a point where you've gotten most of the mass back out. I guess that's what that could buy you. It is interesting, actually, that I think that the difference in timing between those two things is really interesting. There is also a support volume piece that's in there, though, right? Because like the geophysics is averaging over a much larger space. In the stream systems, it's so much more complicated than in the groundwater systems, because here you're averaging over sort of the stream as an isolated unit and then the rest of that aquifer. And so I do feel like the stream systems are a little bit more complicated in terms of comparing the fluid data to the bulk data, because the bulk data is impacted by the fact that it's got this really electrically conductive conduit in there also. So it's a little bit more complicated, but yeah.
So to that point, is there a way to investigate the relationship between the spatial scales of transport and the temporal scales of transport through something like a Fourier number, or like a square root of t over x, very rudimentary?
Spatial scales of transport versus?
The time scale. So here you have a nice time decay. You get a time scale of transport. Sorry, my turbulence pattern.
No.
And associated with that is the volume over which the salt is stored in. And that should be related to some kind of transport equation. And the typical rule of thumb is the square root of time over x is some number.
Let me see if I'm going to answer your question. I may be answering something else completely altogether. Let me see if I follow your train of thought a little bit. But that there are, how do I get at what you're saying, I think? We can estimate things like the area of a hyporeic zone that seems to have salt in it. That is something that we can estimate from these processes. Again, the areas are usually larger than I think that they probably. That's right. So we do have area issues like that, but we can estimate areas through time, and we can estimate rates of exchange through time with the geophysical data. And again, these are just other estimates that are something beyond this in-stream data that we normally have. In terms of process, though, I mean, certainly we can look at both temporal and spatial moments of these data. Let me know if this is not going where you want to go, of both of these sorts of data, and we can say something about process based on the way those moments are changing. And so I showed you a temporal piece here, and so we can say that mean arrival times are related to advective timescales, and variances are related to advective timescales and dispersion diffusion and so on. And we could do the same thing with the spatial moments. I suppose we could take a look at how dispersed that tracer plume is through time. I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question though.
You're going around it. I'm
yeah.
just wondering if it's just because salt goes into the subsurface,
mm-hmm.
it doesn't mean that water flowed into the subsurface.
It could, because of diffusion.
Because of diffusion. And if it's a solely diffusive process, then we would know that the diffusion coefficient is equal to the square root of your
sure.
scale divided by the spatial extent of your thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm getting at is, can we use some of that knowledge to distinguish between what portion comes from just a dispersion process and what portion comes from...
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think that there's potential for this that we haven't quite exploited. And part of that is that I think that the fluid conductivity data will be in sync with the bulk conductivity data in a more straight line type relationship in systems that are highly advective. And I think that we start to see that hysteresis in behavior when we've got something, I don't know if it's diffusion per se, but if we've got parts of the aquifer where there's material that's not flowing and some sort of transfer of salts between a connected pore space and a disconnected pore space, that's when we start to see these hysteresis curves. So I do think there is a way to exploit the geophysical data to help determine where we've got flowing pieces of system and non-flowing pieces of system, but we need all the co-located measurements too. I mean, I don't know that we've actually done a very good job of that here. I feel like we sort of got to the tip of the iceberg with these data and some of the things we could do with it, and then haven't really gotten beyond that. But I think that to parse out advective pieces of our system from the diffusive pieces. Yeah.
I want to argue with Chad. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
Okay, bro.
The problem here is that you've got many different flow paths with very different timescales, and if you average all of those together, what typically happens in this kind of system is you get a power law, which is also what happens if you have a diffusive system, and it's very hard to tell those two apart. I actually have a record of publication of first publishing an idea and then rejecting it, and that's the reason for it, is because these two signals can look a lot. The diffusive signal is, you're talking like that much into the subsurface over 5 days. I mean, it's very good. It's 10 to the minus 9 to 10 to the minus 10 meters squared per second is the diffusivity. So you're not going to get very far by pure diffusion. Dispersion, that's an advection process. Yeah. So I think the hyporeic exchange is effectively purely advective. I mean, more or less. And it actually could look diffusive, but it isn't.
Yeah, it's maybe a dispersive process.
Right.
So yeah. Following that train of thought, though.
Sorry to take
No, it was
If you model it as a dispersive process, then can you use her measurements to back out a, let's say, I'll use the terrible engineering jargon of an effective dispersion coefficient?
Yeah, I mean, you could have an effective parameter.
I guess, it would be interesting to see if we could produce a hysteresis actually on an advection-only system. We could actually have different pathways and still end up with hysteresis, actually. So I guess that actually my thought process there that we would see hysteresis only in diffusion-based systems is not true. We just need different flow pathways. Yeah, so I'm actually not sure if we can distinguish between something that's diffusion limited or not, actually. Because as long as those pathways, that we could have different averaging from different pathways and probably produce the same hysteresis. Yeah.
Setting aside all this theoretical nonsense for a moment, if you just dumped some salt into those wells, and could you get some useful point data that to then constrain your model as well? Because you look at the plumes coming out of the wells, and you've inferred, or you've got other information about the flow, and now you have point sources that would give you some point data.
Yeah, that's actually a really cool idea, because you could do a lot of much smaller tracer tests, I guess, there, and we would image that as well. I mean, there's this is a very different system. The first thing that I thought of when you said that is in the 50s, when people only had a single well, the way they would figure out direction of flow with some of these geophysical tools is they'd set up a square array of electrodes around a borehole, dump a bunch of salt in it, and then take a look at which way things moved. In this case, you sort of know which way material is moving, but those additional data certainly wouldn't hurt. And it might actually be nice to be imaging something where you aren't bombing the entire stream. Because right now what I see is a big blob, basically, because we're changing the entire stream's conductivity and then the material that's exchanging with that. But those smaller tests, as long as we could see them, and that might be the problem, is that they might be too small for us to image. But it seems like that could be a really nice way to try to see more focused pathways, more focused flow pathways, as long as we could catch them. Working at HA was interesting in that, understandably it's an ecological site, and so they were concerned about how much salt we wanted to put in there. And so part of the reason we set this tracer test up the way we had done is we were given a 100 microsiemens per centimeter bump above the background condition. And so we were trying to stick to that. Usually as geophysicists, we'll bomb a stream just because we want to see a conductivity change to the point where we don't have to deal with density dependence so much, and that's kind of the limiting factor for us. But it was interesting working here because it was a much smaller concentration of salt than we would have normally otherwise used, and we see it very clearly. So it would be interesting, at least at the bottom part of the stream, it would be interesting to have had the time to mess around with some other options there. Yeah, those data would have been useful. There's a question over here.
I was going to throw into a very basic concept. So we know it's an advented system, primarily. We can assume it's a bimodal breakthrough curve going through the salt. And we know that over time, you're measuring the concentration. You can do that pretty well with the geophysics. So it's a very basic concept. So why you can't just measure the base flow and then you have a very good estimate of the mass. So I might be missing something, or is it just something that's not being coupled between the two disciplines? Yeah, there's just something not coupled there. Yeah, I actually think that this is not the way to get mass. And so we have other ways of saying something about mass within systems. We could get that even from the concentration histories in these streams, right? You could see how much mass has at least come back to the stream at some point. I just don't think the geophysics is a very good way to estimate mass. I know that stuff is there. I know that there's an increase in concentration, but I wouldn't be able to tell you that 10% of the mass is still left in the stream. I think you're much better off with the stream data or the point concentration measurements from somewhere in terms of estimating mass than you'll ever be with geophysics. Similarly, like I've seen people use geophysics to map out like the water table, right? You know it plus or minus a meter. You're much better just poking a hole somewhere and figuring out where the water table is. Geophysics, the resolution on it is fairly limited, and so there's things it can do, like image changes in salinity with time, and that can help us with saying something about process within systems. And there's other things that's just really bad at, like estimating mass or finding a water table. So I think that it's just not coupled in this particular talk, but your point is bang on that we should not be using this to estimate mass. You get that from your point concentration measurements from somewhere else.
Okay, let's continue the discussion. One floor down, 306, I think. 3006, I'm sorry. There's 3,000 rooms in this building. Thanks.